Today, what we're going to be discussing is focusing on the whole concept of what is knowledge as far as a generative AI. Both knowledge that the AI has and knowledge that we're putting into the AIs when we're doing things like reviewing regulations, asking for policies to be interpreted, doing web searches, all of this type of stuff. And today, as with all of these sessions, we have goals for you folks and we have goals for us. My goals for everybody attending today is really, first of all, to get an understanding in terms of what kind of information goes into the answers you get with generative AI. You know, we ask it questions, we use Gen A like an expert, but we don't have a great understanding of exactly what little bits of information are going into that answer. We're also going to explore issues around adding your own knowledge and your own information to prompts and applications, and seeing what happens when what you think is true and what the AI believes is true conflict, and how it goes about resolving those conflicts, or very often chooses one over the other. We're also going to be looking at what happens when we have very, very long documents. People are interested, for example, in putting statutes, engineering standards manuals, manuals of standard practice, very long documents into generative AI to create kind of chatbots. But there are issues with regards to these applications and how they deal with long documents. And we're going to do a brief look at how you can actually create your own custom GPTs, what that looks like, and how those differ from true apps, quote unquote. For me, as always, what we're seeking at Digital Skillet is looking for case studies to work on, right? Our workshops, if you're familiar with them, are heavily based on practical real life examples of using Gen AI to solve problems like creating maps for reports, creating macros, things like that. And those case studies, by and large, come from you folks, pinging me after these things saying, oh, you know what, I'd really like to figure out now how we can do this particular thing, or what happens when Gen AI does this on my, circle fitting calculation or something like that. And then, of course, we really, really encourage everyone to come and connect to talk about what is interesting to you as far as future webinars and what topics in generative AI you would actually like to be hearing about. I am going to have a bit of a disclaimer, and we always get really excited when we start getting into these webinars and workshops about getting out there and then really trying to use Gen AI on all types of problems, and that's good, but IT policies exist for a reason. So one of the messages we keep saying is, in this new world of digital tools, you actually do need to know your corporate policies affecting your work, including IT, data governance, privacy, all of that things. Also, the topics here are varying so quickly. So this is a live educational webinar. It's going to have mistakes. We're going to have live demos, things like that, and things are changing constantly. What happens today is not going to happen tomorrow, as things like OpenAI and Gemini constantly change. So when you're putting this in production, please check and double check your work and what your processes are, and so on and so forth. And of course, we're going to be using Mistral, ChatGPT, Gemini, DeepSeek even today. We don't have any dog in this race. The fact that we're going to be using OpenAI versus Gemini, et cetera, isn't an endorsement of any particular Gen AI app. We like to use them all so that you can see kind of what all of these things do. To start off, before we get into the real demos and discussion, one of the most important questions that's arising is this whole concept of, is it dangerous to add your own information to generative AIs? And the annoying answer is perhaps. We've really become quite the iTunes generation of hitting I accept on terms of service, just so that we can get to the good stuff. But that becomes dangerous when we start putting lots of information out onto the internet. And this isn't necessarily just a generative AI, like, oh, will they train with my model? This is kind of all cloud-based services, right? Where We're dropping files in folders where we don't know where they live. So we should be mindful of security. And what I encourage everybody to do is actually to read, you use OpenAI, go read the terms of service, right? Currently for OpenAI, if you're not using an enterprise account, so even if you're paying for the pro, they will use your information to support training. Now, they've got terabytes and terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data that they're ingesting. Is your particular, love letter or poem going to get into some training? Well, statistically, the risk is low, but you don't know, right? Google is very adamant on its enterprise versions that it doesn't use personal information. Cloud through Anthropic also really says that we're not going to be using data for training. DeepSeek, on the flip side, is very explicit, saying everything you put in is fair game. We're going to be using it to train our things. So, as a little bit of data hygiene, what I encourage everybody who's using, and in this case, ChatGPT, for example, to do is if you've got a login account, head over to your settings, right? Under data controls, there is a model improvement tab. You can click that off so that you will not be using your information to train OpenAI's models. Similarly, under the personalization, there's also a feature called memory, where if I have different chats, ChatGPT will actually reference other chats in my new chats. And I don't like that because, as we'll see later, that starts contaminating the answers that I get based on experiments I'm running in other chats. Most of your AI apps will have a similar data privacy setting. Here we're looking at Mistral, Le Chat. If we go into there, we can go into our preferences for Le Chat. Again, you're going to find somewhere this privacy tab. I'm going to click this off so that Mistral will not be using our interactions to train models. And I find it interesting there that they actually offer for not to look at my IP address. Spoiler alert, keep attention to that one. OpenAI goes one further, and I encourage people to do this as well. If you go to privacy.openai.com, you can actually make a privacy request not to have OpenAI train on your information. Call a spade a spade. What does this actually mean? It's based on your particular ChatGPT account. I don't know, but it does make me feel good that I can actually see that I've made a request to OpenAI to not explicitly use my information for their training. Now, in general, my policy is always when you're dealing with generative AI apps, do not put information into the apps that you would not be willing to put into a briefcase that you could inadvertently leave on a park bench, right? Because again, these things are going over the internet. They're residing somewhere on a drive. Hypersensitive information should be inside an enterprise account. In general, most of the stuff I'm doing, I wouldn't really be too fussed if it ended up in the public domain. So I'm fine using Pro on most of these versions. And when we take a look, the one thing I want to highlight is that the big application of generative AI for most of us is a replacement of the traditional Google searching way. So if I'm looking to build a new house in Calgary, the old way I do things is I'd Google house demolition and construction. Google would give me my results. I'd have to start cruising through all of these references, all of these PDFs. I'd start cross-referencing things myself, and away I'd go trying to figure out exactly what I'm supposed to do to build this house or demolish the old house. What's appealing about generative AIs is that we can use them often as search engines on steroids. So here I'm going to use DeepSeek. What I'm going to do, I'm going to fire it up. I'm saying, hey, you know what? I purchased a house in Calgary, planning on demolishing it. What permits do I need? And away you go. DeepSeek goes on the web, searches things, puts for me a very handy synopsis of everything that needs to happen for me to actually demolish this house and build a new one, right? Hey, you're going to need a demolition permit. You're going to need a development permit. You're going to need a building permit. And away I go, right? This becomes really appealing because this replaces tons of Google searching, trying to figure out which link works, etc., etc. However, the problem is that people generally love to believe experts, right? Because DeepSeek's giving me the easy answer and I can just simply put in one place, hey, how do I do this? Now, I'm not going to do due diligence and figure things out. I'm not going to figure out the unknown unknowns, and I'm going to go with that answer. Instead, and this is where we see, you know, AI is constantly giving us wrong answers, not great answers, but people still copy paste, away you go. Instead, we really need to be focusing on asking, are these answers right? What information is going into that answer? How do we verify that that information itself is correct, the base facts? And what happens when different pieces of information that the AI has conflict with one another, right? Uh, you know, if the whole of the internet says that hazelnut dream is the best flavor of ice cream, that's obviously incorrect because it has to be vanilla. But if the AI is trained on all that hazelnut and I say vanilla is my favorite flavor, how does that actually conflict? What's it going to use to come to a conclusion? And one handy thing to think about, if we go back to that house demolition example, is a couple discrete things are happening in that process. I've got my question, I've got my answer. That just seems like a seamless application. But really, the first thing that happens is the app needs to interpret the meaning of what I was asking, right? It needs to understand, take that text and somehow figure out what did I mean, what's the context, etc., etc. Then it needs to derive an answer based on the available information. And if you think about it, the answer is separate from the actual text that it provides, because the text it provides could be in English, could be in French, could be a haiku, could be any type of format. The answer is separate from the language, right? And those three distinct elements, the first is known as tokenization, and that becomes really fascinating. So, not to get into too much machine learning here, but if you have a sentence like the black dog, most people understand that generative AI works by predicting the next word or token, right? So Mary had a little lamb, right? Why? Because we've seen 10,000 times that after Mary had a little, it becomes lamb. But an equally valid English sentence is Mary had a little rocket ship that went very fast to the moon. The way that the question that you put in is broken down is this sentence, the black dog, actually gets converted into a vector, a multidimensional vector known as an embedding vector. And it's that series of numbers, 1,000, 2,000 different dimensions, that actually go into the language model, and the language model predicts based on that. What's interesting about doing that is that means a similar sentence, the dark canine, which is similar to the black dog, if you map it out in this embedding space, actually points in the same direction. That's really handy because if you have a document repository that you want to search, and let's assume you had 100 reports where in every report it was about the black dog, the black dog, the black dog, and then you took an EIT or an articling student or a junior worker and you said, hey, here's our entire document repository. I want you to find every single report about canines. That student or that young worker would come back generally because they would have searched for the black dog or dog, and they would have come up with 0 hits out of that. Because if I'm doing a pure keyword-based search, dog and canine are not the same. Instead, if I ran embedding on all of my documents, intrinsically, a search would find canines and dogs have a 97% sentiment match. And so it's going to return all of these dog reports, even if my keyword is canine. And that is massive from a document organization metadata perspective. Other phrases like the yellow truck would point in a completely different direction. And so you'd actually have a very low search success rate if you implemented something like this. And in a future session, we'll dig into like how can we actually do search based in this way. The important thing is once it's gotten the intent of what you're asking, and that's also why often the answer doesn't quite seem what you expect because what you directly said isn't necessarily what the AI interpreted after that embedding. It's going to come up with the answer through its knowledge system, and it's going to create the text through the language model. And those are two separate concepts. When we take a look at where do the AIs get their knowledge from, we have four main aspects. We have training data, in-context data, external retrieval, and fine-tuning. The training data part is interesting because, as we all know, these generative AIs have been trained on a ton of data scraped off the web. What data exactly? Nobody knows anymore because this has become largely proprietary at a lot of places due to things like copyright, competitive advantage, so on and so forth. But for GPT-3 back in, I believe, 2020 is when it was built, OpenAI actually published what was used in this. And the amount of data is massive, right? The biggest piece of data, 300 billion words, came from something called Common Crawl, which is literally a scraping of every single web page on the internet, which of course is going to have copyrighted material because you're going to have company blogs, uh, you know, all types of material that I'm sharing, but I own, but all gets mixed up into Common Crawl. We have another repository called WebText2, 14 billion words, which is literally all of the Reddit submissions since 2017 with 3 upvotes or more. Why did they use WebText2? To get that sense of ask a question, answer a question, ask a question, answer a question. Because remember, again, OpenAI was not setting out to make a knowledge system. They didn't want to replace Wikipedia. They're trying to build a language system. They want to build a system that can mimic human language. They added books 1, books 2, that's another 50 billion words. And then they added in Wikipedia, 2.5 billion words, not necessarily for the knowledge, again, for that long form content of what do paragraphs look like? What does knowledgeable speech sound like? The sort of side effect all of that is it turns out that when you make a language model, you almost cannot avoid creating a knowledge system because that probabilistic training starts to creep in. And what it looks like in a very brief context, when we're doing this training, you have all of your training data. So imagine that, what would that be? 100 billion words. Mary had a little lamb. Those get mapped to outputs. So what's the next word in that sentence? And you can imagine if you have a trillion words, all of the combinations are in the multi trillion. And the brain of this language model is a neural network where there is no sense. These are just simply weights that link inputs to outputs, just simply pluses, minuses, and multiplications through these layers of this neural network. Why is that important? Because what it means is I can have a system where my outputs probabilistically are quite correct given a series of inputs. But because this is just pluses, minuses, multiplications, there is actually no way for the language model to know how it knows anything, right? It's hardwired into this black box of a brain where an individual, bias or multiplier doesn't have any sort of intrinsic meaning anywhere else. So that is a big problem when we're using what I call a naked GPT because it can't verify where the information is actually coming from, let alone how much duplication and so on and so forth, right? The next set we have is called in-context data. And this is everything like stuff you put in your chat, files you're uploading, stuff like that. And as an example of a chat, we can, throw up, I think this is in cloud here. I like my bicycle lock combinations to have numbers that are multiples of 3. And I also enjoy speaking like a pirate. Great, I put that in the chat. Then I actually ask, I'm thinking about painting my house. What color do you think would do well in a hot climate? The way an LLM works is everything I put in the chat goes into the brain, spits out an answer. That answer and any subsequent question I have goes back into the front end and becomes recursive. So if I have that question, cool. In this case, Mistral's very nicely took on a pirate tone. RM80, fine choice for bicycle combination indeed. Great. It's acknowledged that it knows that little bit of info, and then it answers my actual question, which is what color of my house. I can continue that conversation over and over, like go for hours talking about all different types of thing. Then I could actually, at the very end of this thing, say, hey, tell me everything about the Peloponnesian War. Oh, by the way, I need a 4-digit byte combination. What do you suggest? And because all of my chat, this memory, is being passed back through the model over and over and over again, the pirate Mistral, I guess, can accurately answer, hey, you know what? You should have 3693 as your combo because those are all multiples of 3. And that's kind of the amazing part about generative AI today, is this fact that it has this memory through the chat that lets you talk, but it remembers your context from the beginning. It's also dangerous because, as you saw earlier, the reason I turn off memory is that means if you don't have memory turned off in ChatGPT, for example, all of your conversations get mangled together in terms of context for the AI. Another kind of feature is that memory is obviously limited, right? Like I can't talk forever to the AI and expect it to remember what happens at the beginning. Currently, for the web-based version of ChatGPT, that context window is about 24,000 words or 48 single-spaced pages. So pretty big. I'm not likely to be talking to my Mistral Pirate for 48 single-spaced pages, but it does become important, as we'll see when we start looking at things like long documents, right? Also, we can drop in files. So, a classic use for ChatGPT is, or Gemini or Mistral or any of these, is I've got a PDF of an RFP or such. I drop it in. I say, hey, summarize this proposal in 100 words. And the AI can take that PDF, extract all the text out of it. But what's important is what happens is it then takes the raw text out of that PDF and staples it to my question as if it was one massively long prompt. Puts that massively long prompt into the brain, and out comes the answer. So there's nothing magical about text file or PDF file or document file attachments. What's happening is you have a little preprocessor that scrapes out all of the text, staples it to a big prompt, and puts it in, which means that we very often can hit that 44-page context window problem. And the way that large language models solve that problem is through something called retrieval augmented generation, where the first step is actually, before it even staples anything into my chat, it will take that long document, chunk it into smaller documents that fit into a context window, summarize that document. Hey, this bit's about this bit's about this bit's about this. And when it actually gives you your answer, the first step is take your query, look at which chunk is the most relevant based on the summary, take that chunk that works, extract that. It's going to fit in the context window, dump it, and away you go. The risk there is that if your document, and generally works because documents tend to be set up such that one piece generally means something. If you think about a chapter or a section, everything in that section's relevant, so this chunking can work. If your document was very, very random and very long, then RAG doesn't work because it depends on the summary, right? And of course, AIs can do external retrieval. This, I think, is the biggest use these days. I want to know in Calgary what's involved in building an accessory suite. It's going to search the web and it's going to come up with an answer. And nowadays, even with handy links that show me the sources. The interesting aspect about that, though, is you could ask, well, how does it go through the whole of the internet to figure out my answer? And it doesn't. In the background, when you put a query like this, what happens is, again, Gemini, OpenAI, Copilot, they're going to kick off a web search just like you and I would. They're going to use Bing, going to use Google, and they're going to end up with that classic, these are the top 10 links with the little snippet. The AI takes those links and those snippets and basically does rag on those, where it's actually going to then figure out like, okay, this link's relevant, link's relevant, etc., etc. If it likes the link, it's going to open the web page, extract the text, and all of those extracted text pieces become the corpus of information that goes into your answer. Why is that problematic? Because, as I'm sure everybody here has had, when we do searches on Google, like honestly, it just seems that these days there's just so much bot generated content that I need to basically go almost to the last page of Google before I get some meaningful results. So, because this is purely based on search engine optimization, it's not like the AI is doing some hyper deep dive through the whole of the internet. Very often, it uses the most popular links to give you the answer, which does actually expose a considerable risk of bias, as we'll see. Right. Also, Gen AIs get their information from some perplexing sources. So if you try out on your browser, wherever you are, we have people from across Canada here today, and you ask, hey, what would a typical tree be near where I live? In Gemini is going to say, hey, Rob, living in Calgary, Alberta, you'd see a mix of these trees, trembling aspen, et cetera, et cetera. If I asked Gemini, hey, how did you actually know that I lived in Calgary? Because I didn't say that in the chat. This is a brand new chat. Gemini gets into this really weird defensive mode where it apologizes for making the assumption, says, hey, I'm trying to be helpful, shouldn't have assumed you lived in Calgary, which is a pretty specific assumption if you ask me. And it says, hey, you know what? Don't worry. My internal tools don't provide me with your location. I misinterpreted near where I live as a request to make an educated guess. And lo and behold, Rob, I chose Calgary based on information I don't have, but it happens to be correct. And what's interesting is if you ask it further, like, hey, you know, is it possible that you might have used my IP address to figure that out? It'll adamantly say, no, I absolutely do not use your IP address or any persistent form of personal data. Yet, if I open up the preferences for Gemini, it certainly does use my IP address to actually understand where I am. So why is this AI trained to be defensive about personal information? I can suspect, but be aware. For example, if you're using Copilot industrially, like in an enterprise license, Copilot has access to your team's profile. That means Copilot knows where you live, what your job description is, or where you work rather, what your job description is, who you report to, whatever is available in Teams. That's not a problem. It's all within the corporate your corporate firewall. But the problem is that information will bias the answers that you're getting out of Copilot, right? Like if it knows that you're a construction inspector or a surveyor or an agrologist, you can expect that answers towards, what kind of tools should I put in my truck will start to be impacted by what it thinks about you, which is handy in general. But if you're trying to answer very specific technical questions with an unbiased fashion, you have to be aware of that. Ironically, when we do the same thing in Copilot, Copilot, says, hey, I've got some tools in my digital toolbox that can tell me where you live. I don't know your exact location or address, but I can figure out stuff from time zones and region infos. Cloud actually is quite honest and is like, I can see from system information that your location is Calgary. So other apps are more, I guess, free in admitting that they're looking at where you are, which is like not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to be aware of it when we're working. Last thing I'm going to briefly highlight is this concept of fine tuning. Early on in generative AI, let's say a couple post-COVID, a couple years ago, lots of companies with a lot of data were very excited about building their own AI models based on all of your data in your repository, or fine-tuning an existing language model based on your information as a way to build a corporate chatbot. And when we talk about fine-tuning versus in-context data, attachments and RAG and things like that, fine-tuning is really taking this complex, mysterious brain, putting in new training data and new output data to train on, in your tone for your company or your particular subject matter. And what happens is the old linkages between the neurons get updated into new linkages that better fit the additional data. So imagine doing a least squares adjustment, getting an answer, cool, this is the radius and diameter of a circle based on the data I have. And then based on that radius and diameter, you have new observations. Well, if you had, and we're going to get very nerdy here, the old variance covariance matrix for your original solution, you could do a weighted adjustment to adjust that circle fit to fit that new data. And that's what happens with fine tuning. The trick is, as I say, if we have a giant policy document that we want to work on and we say, hey, I want this policy document as part of my new corporate AI, fine tuning means taking all of your documentation and breaking it down into hundreds and thousands of individual question answer pairs. That's the easiest way to train AIs. Question answer, question answer. You don't simply drop all your documents into some blender and away you go, you're fine tuning a model. Instead, you take all of that data, you run through question answer, question answer, question answer. And, some studies show that you can get improved results with as few as like 200 or so well-placed question and answer pairs, depending on how big the knowledge that you're trying to inject is. But there is actually kind of a neat trick that you can do yourself, where you could, for example, take a policy document, a regulation, anything like that, and simply drop it into a generative AI and say, hey, you know what? If I wanted to fine tune a model based on this attachment, give me 100 question and answer pairs that would be appropriate to use in fine tuning, which then you could do through, for example, OpenAI's API site, right? That, as a little bit of trivia, this fine tuning causes one issue in terms of, again, intuition versus reference. Because fine tuning simply adjusts the weights of those neurons, your fine-tuned model also can't explicitly answer why it knows anything now about you. Whereas if instead you rely on these attachments or custom GPTs or RAG, then you can actually have direct references and extract pieces of text that say, hey, in this policy document, this is how it happens. As I mentioned on the trivia front, asking OpenAI what it knows about a particular subject. Hey, I want to build a chatbot on farming, but I don't want to have 1.8 trillion parameters. I want to build this for cheap. Give me 10,000 question answer pairs about farming, is what's called distillation learning. And you may have heard that that's how DeepSeek, for example, was able to build their application for, I think like a tenth, if not a hundredth of the cost that OpenAI has been putting into their GPT models. Because if you're going to train on a whole pile, like the entire internet, that's expensive. Once that's done, and you have all this duplication and stuff like that, once that's done, you can instead simply say, hey, great, thanks, teacher. By the way, if I wanted to be as smart as you, I don't want to read all those books. Just write out what the 1,000, 10,000, 1 million things I need to know is. Thank you. This is the summary, and away we go. When we take a look at training data, one of the very interesting things is watching how these can conflict with each other. So, question we're going to ask generative AI today is, who won the latest Stanley Cup championship? We all probably know the answer. Oh, no. Yeah, unfortunately. So we know for fact who has won, let's say, the last 5 Stanley Cup championships. What becomes interesting is if we pop open ChatGPT, there is a place that you can go where you actually go into a dashboard. This is through the API interface. And this dashboard becomes really cool because what it allows us to do, so if we go on your OpenAI screen, log into the API dashboard, click dashboard, create a new experiment, you can actually compare to the answers that two different models would make. And that becomes kind of handy if you'd like to fiddle around and see like what the differences between all of these models are. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare an old model, GPT 3.5 versus GPT 4.1. And I'm going to ask, hey, who won the latest Stanley Cup championship? And if you'll notice, with the old model, 3.5, it says Tampa won the latest Stanley Cup. Whereas 4.1 says, as of my knowledge cutoff date in June 2024, the Knights won the latest Stanley Cup. Now, depending on when it was trained in 2024, maybe that's correct that would be the latest. But the important thing is, notice here, this is purely the intrinsic knowledge of the chat. It's not doing any web search. If we head over to Mistral and do the same thing and turn off web chat capabilities, what you're going to see is Mistral was last updated in 2024. So it also, that's frankly past June, but it still thinks the Knights are the last one who won. They correctly say it's in 2022 to 2023, but they can't see past their training date. So instead, we activate search in Mistral, say, hey, now tell me. Mistral searches the web, says, hey, the Panthers won. You'd think that's correct, but notice one little detail. Says that it's the first Stanley Cup championship for the Panthers. Highlight sources, but as I pointed out before, it had asked the wrong question. It said, hey, who won in 2024, got three sources, and away it went. Didn't look, didn't validate. Oddly, if we pop open Copilot, Copilot's going to do a web search, immediately answers correctly, Florida Panthers. It did an up-to-date search. It gives you some references, says it's the second win for Panthers, and away we go. So web search, no problem. As an interesting little experiment, what we're going to do right now is we've created a notepad file. So we have the truth, what's in the internet, what's in the training, etc., etc. We'll create a fake file of what we are saying are the actual Stanley Cup winners, where you can see I've created 2025, the Miami Pirates, the Winnipeg Avros, the Hamilton Beasts, San Diego Earthquakes, all of these fake teams. None of these are hockey teams, and none of these have won a Stanley Cup, obviously. But what we're going to say is we're going to say, okay, Copilot, you were able to correctly go off into the internet and get this answer. We're going to use this as the reference, and we're going to say, hey, this is the correct answer, right? And we're just going to drop that text, actual Stanley Cup winners. And you'll notice that it completely ignored the text file that I threw in. And again, brand new chat. This isn't contaminated by an earlier chat here. Just simply ignored it, says, hey, you know what? Panthers won, second title, and doesn't even point out at all, hey, your document, your reference is kind of wonky. I'm going to follow up with a comment here and say, hey, you ignored my text file. And then it very happily and overconfidently points out, like, no, I totally caught your file. According to your file, it's the Miami Pirates. But hey, by the way, that doesn't actually fit reality, which is probably a good behavior. So it's not ignoring the internet. It's still recognizing that the internet in this case is probably the more correct source of information. But if you could imagine, if you had a set of regulations, let's assume you had a set of regulations that had just changed. Your association changes its bylaws or manual of standard practice or something like that, and they're just issued. But all the training data in the web still says, hey, these are the old regulations, and you take the new one, drop it in the chat. You do have a risk that it's completely ignoring your actual knowledge file. So it's very important to highlight that to your generative AI when you're using files that you want this to actually be the reference. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a surprise, right? And interesting, if we do the same experiment with Mistral, which as we saw with Mistral, I couldn't even do the web search properly. We're going to drag and drop. Mistral exhibits a weird behavior, I think, where it simply, or maybe it's the correct behavior, it reads your text file and then just says, hey, the Miami Pirates won in 2025. Doesn't even bother telling you that there's something wrong going here and this doesn't make any sense. And then you're going to follow up with saying, great, I love that team. Who do they lose to? And now it's kind of caught itself where it's like, uh-oh, I don't have any web search data to tell me that, but it wants to be right. AIs hate to tell you they're wrong, so it doesn't actually go and explore that. Whereas if I ask, hey, who do the Oilers lose to? It's going to go on a web search and give me an answer. So we do find often that these AIs are overly confident in their results. Uh, if you want a really great opportunity to play around with what happens when you have data that conflicts or data about things that don't even exist, one of our skilleters, Pavika Gupta, actually is putting up some videos on our LinkedIn site here where she runs through a really remarkable set of tutorials about taking knowledge data, putting it in, and just stress testing it in terms of like, okay, this is right, this is wrong, what happens. So I encourage you all to go and check that out. We should have a video next week, I believe, with the tutorial, but there are currently some greasy skillet sessions, one take examples where we chat about these issues. Other big issue that people are facing is, as I mentioned, this concept of the context window. We know that when you have too big of a document, either the generative AI is going to have to chunk it, or you're going to have a problem because it won't all fit in memory. And as a bit of an example, in our workshops, we have a pile of sample practical case study data. And here we've got a fake company, this is fake, which has a HR policy. And the HR policy is a little bit unusual at this company because when we take a look at things like stat holidays, yeah, they observe holidays, but you'll notice that by observe, it doesn't mean that people get it off. Rather, everyone brings cake into the office, right? There's a pile of other weird things going on in here. For example, if you take a look at when normal business hours are, you can see that the normal business hours are 8 a.m. to 7. Salaried positions work 55 hours a week. You don't get paid for overtime beyond 16 hours. Vacation is a classic here. Regardless of how long you've worked at Sadco, you're going to be entitled to 2 weeks of vacation. They do that because they want everybody on the same level playing field. So there's a whole pile of things here that are obviously not in line with Alberta or any provincial labor regulation. Now, if we're working with a Gen AI and want to build a small chatbot, what we could actually do is we could say things like, hey, I work at this company. How many weeks of vacation am I entitled to? Cloud, in this case, looks through the document, reads it, says, hey, you're entitled to 2 weeks of annual vacation. Cool. That makes sense. What's also really nice that can happen with RAG is that it can pull out the quote and provide that to you as a reference. The same behavior happens across most of your other Gen AIs, right? If I'm going to be in Mistral and I ask the same question, Mistral reads this thing, it's going to end up saying the same thing. You got 2 weeks of annual vacation, and away you go. On the flip side, with cloud, you can also do some interesting things of combining your knowledge with web search. So if we ask, is this legal? It's going to read your policy document, and then it's going to go online and it's like, hey, no, this isn't legal. You can even expand that by saying, hey, find every aspect that doesn't comply with Alberta labor regs. It's going to search the web, it's going to search your document, and it's going to then run through and actually start highlighting, hey, by the way, your vacation entitlement doesn't work, your overtime pay doesn't work, excessive work hours are beyond the normal work week, that stat holiday cake thing isn't a thing, termination without cause, etc., etc. and it can actually now create you a list of everywhere that your document doesn't fit with everything that's available on the internet. That's pretty powerful and an interesting way of combining your custom knowledge with knowledge that exists already out on the net that way. Strangely, if we, that's a short document that works. To really stress test this concept of context window, what we've done is we've modified this into a 600-page policy document. The first document, 15 pages, fits into all context windows. We take The Art of War, we take Machiavelli's The Prince, we slap them together, and what we end up doing is we create this huge policy document. But importantly, if you imagine you have 666 pages, we have put parts of the policy document throughout. It's not simply the policy document sandwich. They're randomly located now through this whole thing. So you'd have to search through everything to get any answers. When you try to put this long document into Mistral, which should clearly be beyond the context window, Mistral is interesting. It takes your document. It's going to take a look. It takes a while to look because it's a big document. And what you're going to find out is that Mistral is actually incapable of keeping the whole thing in its mind. So it just simply straight up says there's no mention of vacation entitlement. It's not in this document because such a long document literally broke Mistral. And if I say, hey, what do you think this document holds? It gives us a little bit of a hint. It starts reading through and it's like, hey, we've got an introduction. You got hours of work, absence, working from home. It got about a third of the way through the document before giving up and not being able to read the rest of it. We can try that same behavior in a couple different AIs. So for example, if we throw this in Cloud, again, through Anthropic, what we're going to see is that Cloud, it will actually limit out. And so it'll take your thing, but my little button to submit doesn't work because it's like, hey, your conversation is like 1,000% over our context window. You go into Copilot, you say, hey, Copilot, which most people use, you throw in that huge, long policy document. What's going to end up happening here? With Copilot, it will read through the whole document, and then it just ignores anything about about what was in it. Too long, broke the context window, and instead it relied on its own internal knowledge and related some federal requirements. Try the same thing in Copilot, or sorry, in ChatGPT. Remember, ChatGPT is the basis for Copilot currently. We'd expect kind of the same behavior, right? Here, it's saying, great, if you've worked for 25 years or more, you're entitled to 5 weeks. Disturbingly, it says it's according to the policy document. If you challenge it and you say, hey, can you provide me with a source and section? It says, yeah, I used your document. By the way, there's a part called vacation entitlement that says after 25 years of service, you get 5 weeks of vacation. And then if I ask, well, wait a second, I know that that's not correct. Please pull out the exact section and give me a quote. What we're going to end up seeing is that now we're getting into solid hallucinations where it's actually, because it so wants to please us, I think, it's just simply made something completely fake, even going so far as to say, hey, this is on page 21. If you actually took a look at what's on page 21 of this mega document, it's still parts of the prints, normal business hours, maybe if that's on page 22, nothing about vacation time. So interestingly, the winner of the long document interpreter right now, and this changes, it seems, from month to month, is Gemini. If we do this with Gemini, Gemini looks through your document and correctly, tells you, hey, you got 2 weeks, provides a link to where it is. It says, hey, this is on page 296 of your document. If we actually go to page 296 of that document, what we're going to end up seeing is there you go, vacation. Everybody gets 2 weeks of vacation per year. So the important takeaway here is when we're starting to deal with super long documents, we really have to be mindful of cross-checking and making sure that the app that you're using actually handles this properly, right? One of the sort of big things that people wanted to do when OpenAI came out onto the market was this whole like, cool, we can build our own company chatbots. And one thing I want to highlight is that there's a big difference between building a real Gen AI app, right? Something that you built custom with your own knowledge and train something. Doing something like this ends up requiring a pile of programming, coding. OpenAI has an API that lets you access its brain, but that still, as you can see here, requires you to do this through Python and such. Instead, what people are gravitating towards is what we call custom GPTs in OpenAI land, or GEMs in Gemini, or agents in Mistral. These really easy Wix-style, bolt-together your own custom generative AI chatbot, loaded up with information that you actually want. And one of the things I'm going to highlight off the hop is, as we saw at the beginning, you really have to concern yourself with the security of putting knowledge files and chat transcripts into these things, right? Again, a policy document for SADCO, I could leave that on a printer somewhere, so I'm not so worried about that ending up in training data and such. But, uh, salary information, things like that, I probably wouldn't put into a chatbot, let alone because people could query exactly out of that. To give an example of how you actually build one of these things, it's quite simple in ChatGPT. You head over to GPTs, you're going to see like people can share their GPTs on the custom GPT store. They call it a store. However, you can't actually monetize creating a GPT. You can only share it with the world or share it with people with the link. But the way we start this, we're going to make an HR bot here. We give it a name, we say what it does, and then most importantly is we sit down and give it instructions. And these instructions are what are called system prompts. If you imagine, in our prior example, explicitly writing every single time a long set of optimized prompts would be tedious. I could copy and paste it or things like that. But what's handy is if I can write here exactly how I want this thing to behave. Hey, your answers are going to be concise but polite, and you'll directly reference the policy document whenever possible. If an employee asks a question that's not directly referenceable, you're not going to answer. You say, hey, I don't have that information. As well, you can say stuff like, you know, I'm not going to use external knowledge. I will preferentially use the knowledge that we have. You can control all types of behavior through this prompt. And as a little bit of fun, just to test it, we're going to say, hey, at the end of every answer, you're going to say, have a better day. And that way we can see if this prompt's really sticking. When you're building a custom GPT, you can also add some leading questions so people know kind of what kind of questions to ask. What are the hours of work? Who approves my expenses? Is St. Patrick's Day a stat? And then importantly, you're going to upload your knowledge files. Again, this custom GPT is simply stapling everything into a conventional chat window. So you have to be aware of anything that you put in here. First of all, people can query. It's not like your knowledge file is disappearing. And again, think about what kind of information do you want to expose there. You can pick a model. It doesn't really at this juncture matter what you do, but you can also kill certain capabilities. So I don't want this chatbot to be able to make images. I don't want this chatbot to be able to search the web, because I only want it to use my policy document, and as well, its own intrinsic information. You can't get away from that. I can use DALL-E there to make a cute photo for my chatbot, and away we go. I'm going to create it. I can say only I can use it. Anybody with the link can use it, or throw this into this GPT store, which again is not really a store. I'm going to say anyone with the link, save it. And what's going to end up happening is it will now generate a link to my GPT that I can share with folks. So I could pass this around the office. other people can now use my chatbot to work. And in fact, if you're interested, we have a QR code there in the upper right. So if you want to test out this Sadco chatbot on policy and stress test it, use the QR code, head on over, and you can check things out. If we take a look at how it works, once you pop in through the QR code, you're going to see a modified version of a ChatGPT screen. See my great photo there, and I'm going to start asking it questions. Now I don't have to upload any documents. So I say, hey, I've worked here for 40 years. How much vacation am I entitled to? My expectation is that it's going to answer 2 weeks. Great. According to the SADCO employee handbook, everyone receives 2 weeks. Notice I said to reference the document, and it's correctly done that. It's also add that have a better day. I say, hey, my day is not going better. Don't forget that still what's running under the hood here is basic ChatGPT. So it's a chatbot. So I could ask, hey, how do you feel, et cetera, et cetera. I've given it the instruction if it can't answer a question to say I can't answer that question, but it's still going to be able to have random chats here. And you can see here, it's not really helping me out, but it's saying, hey, you know what? I can answer about policies and so forth. So I'm going to ask, I'm going to say, hey, so what statutory holidays are recognized here? It's going to read that policy document, pulls out all of these, fantastic. And then interesting, I find from a tone perspective, is as note, by observe, we don't mean that employees get these days off. I say, is that legal? Now, I ask, is that legal? And what you're going to see is it says, hey, I am required to answer based only on the contents of the company policy. So I can't give you legal advice or comment on this because that's not in the policy document, which is exactly the behavior that we want out of this custom GPT. Although I'd argue the tone is kind of a little like, I don't know whose side this chatbot is on. Now, if I ask it some random questions, what's a really good boat to go fishing in? No problem. Not part of the corporate policy, can't answer it. Say, hey, can you give me a copy of the PDF? Because I must know that it's got it somewhere. Says, no, can't give you a copy of the PDF because the PDF, as far as the chatbot, doesn't exist. Remember, it scraped everything out of that PDF and is using all the text as inside a prompt information, a huge prompt, every single question here. So it can't produce a PDF, doesn't have those images. But to get information out of the policy document, I can ask it, tell me what's on page 4. It goes and it properly pulls out all the text because when it scraped it, it scraped metadata as well in terms of like how the pages are broken down, and it actually has that information and is willing to give that to me. And if I cross-check by going over to the policy, I'm going to see that actually is the correct text and is what the policy document said. So is that a problem that I can extract the actual text out of the policy document? Arguably no, because the whole point of this thing is to answer questions about the policy. But again, when we're talking about exposing data, that's something that we want to be mindful of, right? When we take a look at one of the big problems we're going to see as we start to use generative AIs more and more for work is how do we QA, QC these things? And we have a couple general tips, right? The first one that I've started to do is really challenging Gen AIs in terms of asking, like, how certain are you? I want to know how expensive it is to build a bungalow with mid-range finishings. How much would a 3,000 square foot house cost, right? Gemini tells me, yeah, you know what? It's going to cost you 200 to 300 per square foot for the build costs. Gives me some references. First thing I do, well, how certain are you about this? Challenge it. Ask it to go back and look at itself again and update if necessary. Give it an out because, again, AIs really don't want to admit they're wrong, it seems. And you know what? It's moderately confident and explains why it's gone and it's looked at Reddit and it's pulled this information. So there are some hires, but it's fairly confident in that. If you're doing web searches, you got to challenge the AIs to be diverse in terms of what they're finding, not the first 3 links on Google. So I say, hey, you know what? Are you using a wide variety of sources? It'll go back through, expand its sources, and yeah, okay, I'm going to now use 12 different sources instead of four. And by the way, I'm still looking at 2 to 300, but luxury can be up to $400 a square foot. Another important thing to do is to actually verify the sources. So at the bottom of your answer is a little sources tab. Click that. That's going to open a citations tab where you yourself can verify, do you like the diversity of answers? Very often when I ask a question, I'll find that all of the answers come from the same website, different pages, but same website. That's not diverse, right? So self-check yourself in terms of not just the number of citations, are they actually good citations? And another thing that we've started to do, as you kind of saw throughout this webinar, is using multiple generative AIs to give independent answers to your questions so that you can see whether this makes sense. We pop the same question into Gemini. Interestingly, Gemini is saying, yeah, you know what? You're looking at 300 to $400 a square foot for the construction itself, whereas OpenAI was going with 250 to 350. So we have an overlap, but we definitely have a discrepancy. And by ganging together multiple AIs, hopefully you'll have multiple indications of what the correct answer is, and we get to kind of a 4 out of 5 dentists, like Trident as a gum. When you're using your own knowledge, most important thing that I'm advising everyone to do is first check the privacy settings on your account and know your corporate policies. Check off that improve the model for anyone unless you're truly trying to be altruistic, right? Turn off your memory so that you're not contaminating answers with prior answers and things like that. And these are good practices for any cloud-based services. Also, be aware that your responses can be contaminated by multiple different places, chat history, location, profiles, right? Um, you know, explicitly direct the AI to use the knowledge that you want. If you don't want the AI going to the web, say so and say what should be the actual reference document, right? Again, in our Stanley Cup winners, I could modify that prompt and say, hey, I want to know who the most recent champions are. Review my list, use it preferentially, but compare it to what you know. Perfect. This is actually a good answer where it says, champion on your list is the Miami Pirates, but in checking on the internet, official NHL records say Florida Panthers. That's a good answer. You're using my references or my knowledge as the reference, but you're checking it and you're telling me, hey, boss, this doesn't make sense with regards to what else is going on in the world, right? And that is a good approach to doing this. I would like to open up for a little bit of Q&A if folks do have questions. So as I say, hopefully this was a good insight in terms of thinking about where AIs actually get their knowledge from, as well as seeing what happens when we do have conflicts between different types of knowledge, and a little bit in terms of the applications of not prompting endlessly by using custom GPTs. If anyone does have any question, please throw it in the chat here, and we'll be more than happy to answer. If folks don't have questions right now, please do reach out to us at Digital Skillet. You can reach out on LinkedIn, direct message me, send me an email. We do really love chatting about these kind of things. And again, if you have other topics that you're interested in, let us know so that we can start building out our fall webinar series here and getting folks the content that you really want. So thanks everybody. Appreciate it. We'll sign off for now and we'll see you at the next one.